So, in the run-up to him becoming Prime Minister, commentators and politicians from left and right were basically saying that we were about to appoint a left-wing Prime Minister. Now, I've read the book that Andy Burnham did with Steve Rotherham called Head North, and that wasn't the view that I got of Andy Burnham from reading that book. He's now been in post for a few weeks, so how's he doing? Hi, I'm Martin Curtis. This is Change from the Centre, and today we're going to look at the first few weeks of Andy Burnham's premiership. Now, whenever I mention Tony Blair's name, either on this podcast or elsewhere on social media, I get a mass of comments and complaints, basically saying, how dare you use his name? But there is a reality. Tony Blair was Prime Minister for 10 years. Tony Blair is Britain's second longest serving post-war Prime Minister. So when Tony Blair speaks, he is worth listening to. One of the things he did in a report through his institute a few months back was introduce this idea of a radical centre. And it hit home with us at Change from the Centre because it spoke about where a lot of politics is and was. So the Conservatives, when they were trying to work in the centre, were basically inactive and managing things rather than making change that's needed. And that's part of the reason why we're getting further and further behind on infrastructure. But the same was also true of Keir Starmer, where he never seemed to have a plan. So the number one thing I think Andy Burnham has done so far as Prime Minister is to say that he will create a 10-year plan for Britain. Now, difficult part of this, because so much politics is short-term, because we are always looking for the next election. But I hope that by showing that in 3 years, Andy Burnham is making progress on a 10-year plan, that will make a difference. And I hope the Conservatives will steal the idea and throw some matching and some different and more radical suggestions into their 10-year plan. If that happens, we might see a sea change in British politics. And Andy Burnham does want to change politics. It's one of the things he has said. But in terms of policy, he has also made a number of announcements. VAT cut on electricity, £2 bus fare cap, business rate cuts for pubs, rough sleeping initiative. Now, not all of them have been introduced yet, and the devil is in the detail. And that is also true about his massive council house building programme that he wants to introduce. But at least he is trying to say things, and he is trying to show that he wants to deliver. The thing that's going to be important on policy as we move forward is how are his backbenchers going to react? And how is he going to react when his backbenchers inevitably start to stray? So, as far as the bigger picture issues are concerned, it would be hard to say that Burnham hasn't made a start based on his vision. You could argue about whether his vision was right, but it's hard to say he hasn't made a start. So even before he was Prime Minister, he'd made the announcement and was starting to put together this number 10 North office in Manchester. And I know it got a lot of criticism with people saying, why can't this all be done down in Whitehall? But I have a bit of sympathy with him. The benefit of having the office in the North is not in the short term, because I'm sure, of course, a number of staff will have transferred from Westminster up to there. But it's also true that I'm sure there'll be staff in there that supported him as Mayor of Manchester as well. But in the longer term, I would expect that the workforce shift will move more towards people living and working in the North. And so that means that there's less of a Westminster bubble problem in that office. And that should mean not only that Manchester and the North benefits, but the rest of the country too, because the mindset is different. He's already started to make some really significant inroads in terms of where he intends to go on devolution. So the one thing he has to accept on devolution is if he is going to pass responsibility and funding down to combined authority mayors so that they have the authority and the ability to deliver things based on their own vision, he has to accept that that vision will not necessarily be a vision that he supports. Yes, we have a number of Labour mayors, but we also have, as an example, a Conservative mayor in Cambridgeshire, a Reform mayor in Lincolnshire, and he has to let them run and do their thing. And it does seem to be that that's what he wants to do. He's also made some inroads on the idea of dealing with prevention. And this, to me, is absolutely critical. Getting public policy changed so that we are spending money upstream to stop problems happening is fundamental to creating the Britain that every single voter in this country, I believe, wants. Similarly, so is rewiring our country politically. So far, all I've heard from Andy Burnham, I think, is about proportional representation. What I hope he starts to do is realise that that is only part of the picture. And I hope his 10-year strategy talks about what Britain needs to look like in 10 years' time politically. You know, what does the ideal political Britain look like so that it can deal with the problems of the 21st century? One of the things it has to do is up its game in terms of speed and its ability to react to events. Because at the moment, Whitehall is so slow that things are overtaking us and accelerating away from us so that we can't deal with them. But certainly, he is starting to make progress in this area. And it's no surprise because the book Head North that I mentioned earlier talks about this quite a lot. One of the things it talks about is how the Green Book, which Westminster uses to decide where and how money is invested, is skewed toward areas that are already successful. And what he has to do is find a way of enabling those areas that are successful to deliver based on the vision of that local leadership, and try and use Westminster's funding to actually improve those areas that need improving and that have the potential to be economically beneficial to the country. And that's really, really difficult, which is why if you take a map of deprivation from 30 years ago and sit it alongside a map of deprivation from today, you'll see very, very little difference. And that basically is a symptom of 30 years of failure. The question I would ask is, what is there within Burnham's programme so far that we've seen that is particularly left of centre? I don't think there's much at all. There are a couple of areas where the proof of the pudding is definitely in the eating. An example is that his commitment about returning privatised companies back into public ownership, in particular the water companies. If he is strictly going to just bring them into public ownership, there's all sorts of questions about the practicalities of how that happens. But that also is a sign that, yes, he is leaning quite heavily to the left. I would argue that that is about regulation. It is about control, and that could be about control in terms of the amount of profit that they're able to take out. But it's more about control to make sure that those companies are delivering the infrastructure that they should deliver to keep Britain up to date and capable of meeting tomorrow's growth. And I would say that one of the things we also need to do with the water companies is look at the Environment Agency, because I think they've let us down there, but it's also true that they've let us down in a number of other areas as well. And you have to ask, therefore, where is the major failure? What Andy Burnham does with council housing is important too. Is he just going to give councils the power to build houses? That's a difficult thing to do, by the way, because they haven't delivered houses practically for many years. Or is he going to enhance what is going on now, which is that some councils have set up their own building companies to build their own houses, but not all of them are council houses? Or is he just going to allow and give more funding to housing associations to meet that demand? As I said, the devil is in the detail, so we'll see. But the big indicator to me is going to be around finances. There are two things that I think are a given with Britain's situation at the moment. We cannot afford to borrow more. We're borrowing at about 95% of GDP at the moment. What we also can't do is raise taxes significantly. And if Burnham does kowtow to the left and raise taxes on millionaires, he has to show he's working out. Every single tax rise that any government or chancellor does has an implication somewhere. And chancellors have to start saying what those implications are. If there is going to be a drift out of the country because we are taxing wealthier people more, we have to be able to measure the extent to which that happens and the impact on the economy. But certainly a responsible prime minister, in the circumstances in which Britain sits today, will have to show how they are going to reduce taxes in the long term. And part of that for me is about the prevention strategy that we talk about quite a lot on Change from the Centre. Inevitably, after just a few weeks of a Burnham government, the conclusion to this video is going to be that it is too early to say how well he is doing and too early to say where he sits politically. Now, I'm pretty sure that if you're a signed and sealed member of today's Conservative Party, you'll be looking at the spending pledges and saying that's socialism. It's actually not. And the Conservatives have lost the sense of value, and they've lost that sense of the need to make radical change, which our country desperately needs. What Andy Burnham has to show is that he has the sense of fiscal responsibility to be able to make the change we need, including beefing up our defences, whilst not breaking the bank. And we can assume that we'll get a sense of how well he is willing to do that and whether he is willing to do it when it comes to the first budget. Once again, thank you very much for listening to what I've got to say. Please consider liking and subscribing, and please consider leaving a comment. But once again, thank you very much.